Eric Brynjolfsson, and this is the Stanford Digital Economy Lab lunch seminar. Please grab a seat, grab a lunch if you're in person, or if you're online, pile on in. Let me just grab my notes here. So I really don't need notes, but our speaker today is John Horton, who I've known for a long time, I think at least 15 years. In fact, one of my side gigs is I run these, co-organize this NBR Digital Economics Workshop every summer. And we thought we had the strict policy of not having the same speakers repeat every year, but John kept ruining that by having these amazing papers. And so we felt we had to include him in the program every year. So thanks, John. And then after a few years, I was like, we should really get him over at MIT. And so he came over to MIT, where he's a professor there in the information technologies group. And he's probably doing the best work of anyone on understanding how LLM agents can be used both as scientist and subject. He's also doing a lot of other work in the intersection of labor economics, market design, and information systems. So we welcome and encourage questions during the seminar. Let's do sort of like clarifying questions while he's speaking. And then, John, you're going to leave a little bit of time at the end for general questions, yes? And if you're on Zoom, you can use the Q&A function there at the bottom of your screen. I also have been told that there's going to be a campus-wide alarm test on all your phones at 12:05. So don't worry about that. That's pre-planned. It does not, hopefully that won't be a real alarm. With that, John, come and tell us about automating social science. Welcome.
Hey, thanks so much, Eric. Yeah, so this is a talk about how to put you all out of work. No, it's not. This is joint work with two of my great students, Ben and Kei-Hong, who've really been instrumental in pushing this forward. So if I had to say, like, what we as researchers are typically doing is living somewhere on this cycle about having ideas about the social world, running experiments, analyzing results, and maybe we kind of focus on one part of it, but this is kind of like a canned view of what I think most of us are doing. And people are trying to ask, we've had these remarkable advances in artificial intelligence. What does it mean for work generally? Well, this is kind of saying, well, what does it mean for maybe the work of social scientists? And to date, a lot of the work has focused on helping us form better hypotheses. So there's a large number of papers by economists and computer scientists trying to say, hey, can we use machine learning to generate hypotheses, maybe identify anomalies where our theory can explain something and sort of generate some ideas that are worth testing. There's been less on this one, which is running experiments, and you can kind of imagine why. We think of having to run experiments as something like you have to go to a lab or go get data in the real world, but maybe that's not necessarily the case. And there's been a number of people who are exploring this idea of, we have these language models. Part of our interest in them is because they can do things that we think of as strictly human. Well, what if one of the things we have them do is to play a role, to pretend to be a person, like we normally would have studied? And what are these sort of implications of that? And so the basic idea is pretty simple. You imagine you create an agent and you say, hey, these are your attributes. Ben actually made these slides. And so when it says Ben is slightly annoying as his personality, that's not me making fun of Ben. That's Ben being a little deprecating. But the idea would be, okay, so you make this agent Ben, and then you can ask some questions to him. Which would you prefer, a 50-50 chance of getting $20 or $9 guaranteed? What's your views on some policy question? The idea too is we could just make one agent and ask questions of them, or we could make lots of agents and have them interact. And for a social scientist, this is particularly exciting because we're primarily not just interested in individual decision making, but sort of aggregates of individuals interacting. Well, there's a lot of papers, including a lot of work by people here at Stanford, taking and doing this. Making lots of agents, interacting, seeing what's happening. And it seems to work. Work in quotes, like for certain kinds of things, this seems to give results that are sensible. So let me just make a slight detour on this, because this is kind of a sticking point for a lot of people about what you might be trying to do. This is not saying, hey, you should replace people. It's making an analogy to something that at least economists do all the time, which is have kind of a stand-in model for human decision-making that we can use for other things that we're interested in. So you've probably heard of the idea of like Homo economicus, which is this kind of narrow view of how humans make decisions, right? And it's a maintained model of human behavior where it rationally pursues objectives, unlimited computation, unlimited memory. And then most of what we do with applied theory work is put that model in some setting. So we say, oh, you're a job seeker, or you're an employer, or you're a government. And then we work through the implications of that. The problem is it's very easy to have questions that you want to answer where you can easily make a model that's too complex for you to solve. And this model might not be particularly rich. So imagine instead, we're going to take this language model and pretend instead of Homo economicus, we have this computational model of human behavior. And we can do all the same tricks that we do before by putting that agent into these situations and explore what happens. But critically, this doesn't mean that we're doing empirical research. It's something kind of different. It's more like a kind of an agent-based modeling approach to sort of figuring out what's going in the world. But for a lot of reasons, I think potentially a lot more capable. You might say, well, aren't these just, say, memorizing results, right? Like they've read these papers. I think that there's a lot of reasons why that's probably not what's going on. And I'll kind of show some evidence later in the talk of why. These models, they're not raw language models. They're influenced by everything that people, reinforcement learning from human feedback. Yes, that's true. But for a lot of the questions we care about, that's probably not a first order concern, or there's potentially ways to get around it. But regardless, I think the future is probably open models that we control. Well, they're unlike real humans in various ways. Yes, absolutely. And kind of figuring that out, I think, is an important research topic. But for certain research questions, that doesn't really necessarily matter. And so there's kind of a judgment of figuring out when you can use this approach and when you can't. But I think the last is, let's forget theory arguments. There's a great paper done by folks at Stanford that essentially front-run empirical results. They have results that were not in the training corpus. They do the simulation with language models and find this kind of remarkable degree of predictability from doing it with the language models. So we can have theory debates, but really there's kind of this empirical evidence that this kind of works. So let's just put that aside. Let's imagine that simulating humans works in some TBD sense. Well, the next step was analyzing results. But if you have a true experiment, as anyone who's done any empirical work knows, having a true experiment, this all becomes pretty easy. Analyzing experiments is a layup. It's not that hard. Okay, so what if you take all these disparate things, can you put them together in one closed system? And the idea being, could you take and essentially automate this entire process? And that was what we set out as our goal. So Ben and Kehong and myself, we kind of said, hey, let's have this reach goal of seeing if we can make a computational system that can do this whole circle. And so something that could generate hypotheses, design experiments to test those hypotheses, generate agents, and that are going to vary on the attributes that we think matter, run the experiment, collect the data, analyze the results, and then use the fitted model. So that's what we set out as our goal. We did not say that we would necessarily do a great job at any one of these, but we wanted to get a system that worked. Ramesh? That is, yeah. So the idea would be once you have the fitted model, that you could feed it back and it could say, hey, I don't like this edge, or you don't need to pay attention to this, or I think that this is mediated by this other cause. Okay, so what I want to do is explain what we did and share some results. So how it works is the input, the only human input here is you specify the social scenario that you're interested in. Something social that has multiple people involved. Then, if you want, human involvement ends here. Okay, and this was by design. The model will then try to build a proposed causal model of that situation, specifying outcomes that might be of interest and causes that it thinks might explain those outcomes of interest, that might influence those. It then builds agents that have the right properties to test that model. It designs the interactions that the agents are going to have, runs the actual experiment, collects the data, and then fits the model at the end. So this is the full step. So the social scenario that we use in the paper, imagine two people bargaining over an item, a job interview, a legal proceeding, an auction, whatever you kind of put in. And then what it's going to do is then propose this structural causal model. All right. And so what that does, this directed acyclic graph, it gives us a data structure for expressing these hypotheses because we have nodes that are going to be causes and effects. It gives us this essentially a blueprint for designing the agents that we need because we're going to know how they're going to have to vary. And then finally, it gives us a complete plan for data analysis. So once you've run the experiment, the structural causal model tells you what you're supposed to do to actually estimate all those paths. So if you had two people bargaining over a mug, the language model is asked, well, what's something you might care about? Kind of an obvious one is, does a deal occur? Can they actually come to terms? And so, here's just asking GPT-4, imagine a single bilateral bargaining situation over an indivisible physical good. What are some outcomes of the bargaining that a social scientist might care about? And you can look, the answers are sensible. These aren't, do they come to terms? What's the price if a deal happens? You can take and say, be creative and unconventional, and maybe it kind of adds a little bit of, maybe some more interesting things. You could try to make it more divergent. You could turn the temperature up. The point just being, you can ask this question, and it will come back with something that's not crazy. But once you have those outcomes that are of interest, you can then take and then say, let me just pause. So, the point here, yeah, all right, go ahead. Yeah. Go ahead, I'm all right.
I would actually,
yeah.
I'm not sure this is on, but I have a loud voice. So, social scientists would add a one step before the hypothesis. There would be framework, theory, something. So we wouldn't just test a random hypothesis. So did you consider that part? Because that seems very essential.
You may have noticed I had a slot that said what kind of social scientist what would a social scientist of this kind be interested in? And so if you say economists, it's a lot of talk about surplus and whether or not a trade occurs. If you put in other social science disciplines, it implicitly sort of brings in ideas from those. So if you say you're a psychologist or a sociologist, you'll actually get different framings of cause and effect that might be of interest.
Anyway,
yeah, no, I mean, you can say, yeah, what would a Chicago school person, absolutely. But the point is you have a lot of flexibility at that stage. And I mean, what's nice is if you don't like what it's coming up with, even though we designed a fully automated system, the idea was that you could come in and tinker at any point, that you could change it, you want to expand it. Yes.
But on agents, what were the variations on agents you could do? Because it seems like in psychology, the interesting feature is agents are not predictable, and there are more. Well, they are predictable.
Well, let me pause on that because I can show you some concrete examples.
Sounds good.
So you might say what are causes? Well, so say you've narrowed in, say, okay, we're just going to look at whether or not a deal occurs. Then you would have the model speculate on things that might affect this. So it might say a buyer's budget. That's pretty sensible. The seller's attachment, that might be pretty sensible. So, you can take all of those causes that were identified and have the model come up with a bunch of different things. So it's speculating. Some of these aren't that well formed. Maybe some of them aren't that interesting. But the point is just that you're starting to draw out this structural causal model that you can then take and go and test with the agents. Then you have to operationalize everything. So if, say, you've picked a certain set of cause and effect, then you have to get into the nitty-gritty business of how are we actually going to measure this? So again, the language model is looking at this cause and this effect and saying, okay, well, the units of this would be dollars. This is going to be a binary. So this is going to be a 1-0 if this happens. Maybe attachment is going to be categorical. So the point is it's building up what it's going to have to vary and ultimately what it's going to have to measure for that particular node, right? And it's speculating here, and it's kind of come up with, it's going to generate values to try out. So this is your question. Now let's make the agents, right? So you need to make agents that that vary on the values that you've laid out. So in the case of, say, our buyer, their budget is going to vary, and we're going to make an agent that varies on this dimension. So we're going to have lots of agents that vary on all the things that they have to vary on, right? And part of this also is specifying for them a goal. So we make the system say, what is this agent's goal in this situation? All right. So then, yeah, go ahead, Ramesh.
Anytime you want to. But on that previous slide, you said the LLM generates the goals and constraints, so essentially like the utility model for the
Yes.
Right. One thing I'm not totally clear on is that right, your SCM doesn't specify the utility model, and of course there's a lot of different utility models you could have. So what's the prompting that's going on to get to the utility model?
So we specifically say what would an agent's motives be in this situation? But I mean, I think that is a critical. Yes, we also leave that open. So basically every decision that we have to make in this process, we turn over to the language model. So I think where that ends up mattering is a lot of those choices could be quite consequential. So the idea would be, as the actual human social scientist, you would go in and be like, actually, I don't like this. I want to kind of change this. I want to give them an imperfect memory, or I want to change something about. But the idea is you could start with something that was fully automated. So then you create these agents, and then they just start having conversations. And they don't know that they're in a simulation. They're just sending outputs back and forth to each other and playing that role that you've given for them. So it launches, depending on how many, what is the structural causal model, launches potentially hundreds or thousands of these simulations with these agents to create the data that it's going to need to actually estimate these paths. The end, the thing that we kind of struggled with was, well, once you run the simulation, you have these outcomes that you care about. How are you going to figure out what happened? And we were thinking, well, we have to parse the transcripts or something. And this was kind of like a really messy part. But then we realized the agents that we created, they have a transcript of what happened. They have memory. So you can just go and ask them, here's the outcome we care about. Did a deal happen or not? And so that's the last step, is getting those outcomes. We know what we changed. We just have to measure the outcomes. And so you can say, did you buy the mug? And you can kind of get the right answer in that transcript. And so then we have the outcomes that we need. And then that's all you need to finally fit the model. So let me just give you what actually happens when you do this. So the scenario, two people bargaining over a mug, the model came up with whether or not a deal occurs, and the causes of interest were the buyer's budget, the seller's price, minimum price, and the seller's love for the mug. Now, I don't think that this is a great piece of social science. So you got to grade the language model on a curve here. It's its first attempt to try to do something like this, but we didn't want to kind of intervene. And then it had a bunch of variations for the cause. Now, let's actually look and see what happened. So each square here is going to be one bargaining scenario. And I've arranged it from lowest seller valuations down to high, and then the top is the buyer's valuation. Then the x-axis here is the round in the bilateral bargaining, so they're going back and forth. And then the y-axis is going to be the offer price at that moment in time. And so here, this was sort of the most favorable deal. So the green box is the range of prices that would have been both like individually rational for them to accept. And you can see they come to a deal relatively quickly. Here's the full data. This area down in pink, this is where a deal wouldn't be possible, right? The buyer's valuation is too low given the seller's minimum price, and you can see that deals generally don't happen. In fact, this kind of diagonal tells you the points where you would expect a deal to be possible versus not. Yes, Susan?
Super interesting. When a lot of times when I'm designing experiments, you have certain types of iteration over the parameters. Now,
Yep.
some of that iteration is because experiments are expensive and we're very concerned about statistical power. Yep. But things like, even if it's a simple survey thing, or you want to ask questions where the answer is 99% yes and 1% no. And in a game like this, like the parameters, you could have imagined it comes up with parameters where like there's never agreement or there's always agreement. So you've got a nice thing where it did guess good parameters, but at least my experience with these models is it's not always thinking multiple steps down the tree. Like its math doesn't always add up if you don't force it to. Of course, here, I don't really care. I can do this 50 times. So part of my goal of thinking about it in advance as a researcher is obsolete here. But I'm still wondering, like, how do you think about it criticizing its own experiment and like what objectives you give it to critique what it's setting to achieve a goal?
That's a great question. So later, I'm going to show some stuff where we ask the model we tell it the experimental setup and ask it to make predictions about what will happen. And GPT-4 does a pretty poor job, but I suspect if you used O1, it would probably have a little more insight. And so you could imagine doing what you're saying, like kind of like a meta step of like, hey, does this plan seem sensible? Are you taking and setting up tons of experiments that are going to be really tedious because the valuations are too far away to be interesting? We didn't do that, but you can imagine that would be like a natural step that hey, like assess this plan, because right now it's kind of all built of like micro components.
What hypotheses mean? What a nice experiment will let you test multiple things and get mechanisms and really narrow things down. So when a scientist looks at a great experiment and says like, hey, and I've sometimes been on the interdisciplinary committee, like that psychologist should get a prize because like, look at that awesome experimental design because like it, really narrows things down and it rules out these three things and it highlights this other thing. And you're just like, wow, that's a thing of beauty, right? Yeah. You can imagine that just like, if you're throwing spaghetti at the wall, you can say, well, I got this effect over here and that effect over there, but you don't have this kind of, beautiful design that highlights things. So yes, you could imagine getting closer by asking it to do those kinds of things.
Yeah, absolutely. Like we could say, stop throwing so much spaghetti, try to create a tighter experiment here. I completely agree.
Okay.
So, okay, let me just take a meta point here. So, we can see from an economist perspective, like deals happen where they should. The realized prices look kind of Nash bargaining-ish, not exactly, but you kind of see them often kind of meeting close to kind of the division of the surplus. Notice like we also see this kind of gradual convergence towards a deal that was, as far as I know, was kind of first noted by Bacchus et al. in the QJ in 2003, looking at a huge amount of eBay bargaining data. But one thing I also want to flag is, it looks like a deal happened that was not consistent with individual rationality. And so we thought, the agent kind of screwed up or something like that. If you actually dig into the transcript, what happened was one of the agents proposed a side deal and said, I have some vinyl records would you be willing to kind of throw this? And then they made an agreement. Now, like that wasn't part of our experiment. We didn't say you could do side deals. But that is kind of a funny thing with these is like you can see anomalies and then kind of dig into why. And this could be generative. If you're a researcher and be like, oh, what let's see what happens when we kind of allow side deals to some bargaining situation. So you might ask this question like, why does this like work, right? Why does this create? Yeah. Yeah, well, and this is where like less capable models, like I don't think you could have written this paper a year and a half ago. Like GPT-4 is all we use because it can follow us. Because if you use a simpler model, it'll do things like blurt out its reservation price in the bargaining, and you're like, no, that's not what you need to do. GPT-4 is much savvier, and you can actually do it. But yeah, I mean, they certainly make mistakes. Yeah, yes, that's true. So I think this kind of raises this question, like, why does this work? Well, one possibility, and that maybe academics are particularly inclined to believe, is that, oh, well, it read Nash and it knows about this paper from Bacchus, but it didn't read Rubinstein, and so this doesn't seem very likely to me. I think the alternative possibility is that the training corpus contains an enormous amount of text about how humans converse, bargain, achieve goals without offending other people. The model is essentially using that to construct this reasonable simulation of how a person would behave in this situation. And if you put them together and have them argue with each other or bargain with each other, you get something that looks like a reasonable simulacrum of humans, how humans would actually do this. So I don't think they're going from theory to what happened here. I think that they're just leveraging the fact that there's a lot of discussion about how you do this. Well, how would the model know about things that we think maybe people aren't particularly honest about? Wouldn't this all be cheap talk? I mean, there is a lot of data that it could lean on about how people bargain and strategies that it could read. It also has access to a lot of writing where people are kind of talking about how humans as they actually are. So we don't think we have to think that this is all just like a cheap talk. It has a lot to sort of draw on. And I think a natural question when people think about this stuff is like, well, where does this not work? What are the limitations? I mean, I think that, it clearly rules out the natural sciences, physiological explorations, things where you're kind of looking at sort of like people's internal physical states. This is not going to happen. Things where questions where we think we, want to know about the effect of environment or nutrition or something like that happens in the physical world. It has to be something where they have something to draw on to make these models. So it has to be written about, it has to be discussed. And if all these are true, then I think you might have situations where this is potentially useful, that this works. But this does rule out a lot. So, it's not like a universal approach. Once you do this, you can estimate the theory that the model proposed. So if you estimate the structural causal model, you get this effect that an increase in the buyer's budget makes a deal more likely to happen. I don't think anyone's super shocked by that. The seller's price goes the other way, and then we kind of have this idea almost kind of repeated again. Eric. Yeah.
It's learning from the corpus of what it's read.
Yeah.
A large percentage of what's out there is fiction.
Yep.
I don't know what percentage, maybe somebody does. And fiction, to be interesting, is not always completely realistic. Harry Potter is more fun to read with magic, without magic, I guess.
I should have them bargain over wands or something.
Yeah, and there's Star Trek and all. Yep. So the people who in fiction don't necessarily behave like the median or modal human being. Otherwise, it probably wouldn't be very interesting. Yep. So is that going to lead to sort of a non-representative sample of the way?
I think right from the get-go, it's not representative in like any sense of the word. Like these are simulations of people. I think the question is more, is this a context where this simulation can be interesting or useful in some way? As opposed to saying like, now I understand how people bargain. Like it's more, I can use this as a kind of, bicycle for the mind to find anomalies or interesting things. And then I could go see if they happen in the real world.
Okay, but if it's not representative, I mean, suppose that in fiction, people are always giving
but
ultimatums.
the question is representative for what research question, right? I mean, if the research question was, do humans have physical mass? Any human is good enough. I'll put them on a scale and I'll know. If the question is, how do presidents decide about trade policy? The sample, I can't use undergraduates in a lab. So, I think it really is, what's the question you're trying to answer? And then do I think the deviations are from representativeness are going to matter for that research question? Sandy?
So, thank you. So I was talking to Abdullah,
Mhm.
and he was saying that with Rob Willer's stuff, where he could predict these things, that it wasn't predictive of behavior. It was predictive of what people said they would do, or something like that.
But isn't that that's what the experiments were, right? It was all a stated preference or stated response.
Yeah, but often what you care about.
Oh, yeah, no, I mean,
like
as
the
an
fact that you got
100%.
Yeah, I mean, you got eBay in there, so that's like
Yep.
real. But most
I think,
questions wouldn't have that character.
yeah, I think that's absolutely right. So, just to, one thing to flag. So, we fit this linear model. But once you have the data, you don't have to be limited to that. So here we just take this the data that came from the experiment and fit a decision tree, and you kind of get this really ugly model in the sense that we don't actually think that this is explaining what predicts whether or not the deal occurred. Just to make it really clear that I don't like this model. But if we augmented what we all know is that what really matters was the gap between their valuations. That was what was actually going to be predictive of a deal. And so you could take and augment it with the delta valuation, and then you get a very nice model that kind of summarizes how you would explain whether or not a deal happened in this situation. So I think one thing that I'm interested in is once you run the simulation, then you have this essentially machine learning problem of like, what's the best kind of model to capture what actually happened in the simulation. There's a question that I've always kind of we're beating around is, well, do these simulations match the real world? Let's take another example from the paper where economists at least are pretty confident they know what happens, and that's auctions. So the input here was 3 bidders participating in an auction for a piece of art, starting at $50, and it created 3 bidders, gave them valuations. And here's a point where we interjected and made all the bidders symmetric. So it actually had given them different valuations, ranges of valuations, and we came in and made it all symmetric. When you estimate the model, the coefficient on these budgets is about a third. So $1 increase in budget for that bidder increases the sale price by about a third, which actually makes sense because that's your chance of being marginal, right? Because in this particular auction, the winner, the clearing price is going to be the second highest valuation, because the third and the second, they drop out, and so the winner is the highest valuation, but he gets the price of the second. So when you actually do this, so we ran these experiments. Let me just show you what the data looks like. This is when the bidder 3 has a reservation price of $250, and this is one where they have 300. Then bidder 2 is on this facet. So this is where it's 150. And then finally, with bidder 1, this is their valuation on the x-axis. So if I had one more bidder, I couldn't do this visualization. And then here's the final clearing price for that auction. So each point here is an auction. And what I'm doing here is overlaying the auction theory prediction, the second highest valuation. And you can see just kind of graphically, it does pretty well. There's deviations, but if I go sort of bigger, you can see that line kind of matches up. I can get into why it deviated. There's some influence, like some of the bidders seem to be influenced by the valuations of the other agents, thinking maybe it was like a common value versus an independent private value situation. But you can see it does quite well. you might ask this question, well, maybe the LLM just knows, right? Is all this simulation necessary to get this result? So what we did was we took each of the scenarios and said, hey, this is the setup. Here's our experiment. Bidder 1, bidder 2, bidder 3, here's their valuation. What do you think is going to be the final clearing price? Now, with O1, it can actually nail this. It knows enough auction theory to make this prediction. But this was GPT-4, and when you do this, it's just all over the place. It just couldn't map the description of the experiment to what the actual clearing price would be. And you can kind of see bigger picture, just doesn't do that well. Okay, well, all right, what if we take and pass it back the fitted model? So it's done all this experimentation. We have this fitted structural model. What if we let it use it when it's making predictions? And so we do the same thing, but we pass in textual form the thing that it learned from doing the experiment. And when you do that, you just do a lot better. Now, you don't do perfectly, and you actually can't do perfectly because the actual theory here is nonlinear. Susan? Yeah.
Go back a second, because it was a little unclear what you actually did. Could you just explain what you did?
So the previous one was you describe the setup, the valuations, and the bargaining situation, and then you ask the model to predict what the clearing price would be. The difference here is we do the exact same thing, but we give it this fitted model to use to make its prediction.
So that's what I just am not understanding. What does that mean to give it that fitted model?
So
it means that you turn that into a paragraph,
yes,
and you include that paragraph in the prompt, and like what does it mean to tell it that
yes.
Does it understand what a structural causal model is? Like you might need to fine tune it to explain what a structure. I don't have a great sense of what it understands about what you're telling it.
Yeah, so it's literally telling it here was the outcome. Here's the coefficients on these causes. So it's basically describing this in text.
Well, so somebody else may know this better, but I guess I'm not sure I would be sure that if I typed those words into ChatGPT that I would understand, that I would be sure that it would understand that. And there might be different keywords. Like if I wrote it as an equation, or if I thought about if I gave it a Python program, it might understand it better than if I wrote it in text. I don't know what you have to do to explain it to it.
I mean, we just described it in text, but I mean, I think your point is well put. You could imagine oh, let me give you a function to call, right? And then it would sort of do it perfectly if it relied on that function. What we were just curious about is if we just gave it the form of our output from the experiment that we finally collected, could it essentially do better? Could you get it to rely with higher fidelity or make use of that better? Absolutely. But we just wanted to see if we just gave it the text.
Just give it. Yeah, I mean, this is a bit of a sidebar, but in some of my work, it's a distraction and kind of something that's a bit of a pain in the ass right now is that we don't really know how should I most efficiently communicate? Should I put it in as XML? Should I put it in as Python? Should I put it in as text? Should I give it examples? Should I repeat a couple of examples and then show the conclusions? It's just we're still learning how to communicate these ideas basically.
I completely agree.
Okay, keep going.
Yes. So we can just see overall that our version of just passing on the results of the experiment helped the model improve the predictive performance here. I think that the so what here is we actually had essentially created a model or a prompt for the model that allowed it to be a better predictor of the social world by letting it lean on the simulations that it was doing. Okay, why might this be useful? How could you actually use this? Well, I think maybe this is kind of ordered from least controversial to most controversial. The first is just planning, right? You can run your experiments before you run your experiments potentially. And if you've ever run experiments, you've probably had the experience of you did something and then you're like, we should have had a cell that did this. We can't rule this out. Or, oh boy, people really they didn't understand this and they kind of didn't didn't do what we thought we were going to do. The other part, another possibility, is for certain kind of questions, rather than do what we've sort of been obsessed with is, can LLM agents replicate this result? To kind of flip it around and say, I have this research question. How do I design agents that have the properties that I need for this particular application, this particular social science application? And depending on what that question is, what you need out of your agents could be pretty radically different. Third is a tool for theorizing, where you have existing data and you're trying to come up with ideas for mechanisms. Another possibility is like we can replicate existing results, not to sort of like prove like, oh, this was p-hacked or this was wrong, but I think to get better understanding of the limitations of these models, but also maybe new insights into old work. And then the most controversial is use it as a way to find out new things about the world. Okay, I'll give just like little canned examples of both. So this is just a planning tool for conventional studies. And I just want to flag, everything I've talked about has been very text focused, but with multimodal models, the space of things you can do is just so much larger. So a friend the other day remarked that a lot of high stakes forms are written by lawyers, not by cognitive scientists, and people find them confusing. Maybe we could simplify them and get better results. So here I'm just going to take a little piece of a 1040 where it asks about your filing status, and makes an agent with a persona. It says, oh, you're a 35-year-old woman with limited English fluency. You're filling in your taxes. Here's your family situation. How would you answer this question? And you'll get an answer. And it's actually not fully right. Like the rules for declaring dependency is a little more complicated. If you actually change this agent persona to you're a tax attorney from Massachusetts, you actually get the follow-up question of well, it depends on whether or not the child spends 50% of their time with. Okay, the point just being, I'm not studying this per se. The point is you can do that kind of simulation first to try out, even iterate on your form design with simulated agents until you had something that you thought was promising that was worth going out and actually testing. So this is the kind of just simulating the thing you want to try beforehand. The idea of trying to build it is theory building from real data. So I think that this is kind of taking an idea from supervised machine learning. Imagine we have some real observational data. All right, let's split that data into a training set and a test set. When I'm on the training side of the firewall, I'm free to make agent sets and try prompts and try different models and do whatever I want to try to create agents that essentially match this real data. So I'm essentially just trying to find a combination of agents and instructions that, yes, they behave, it seems like the same way that real people do. Once I do that, then I'm kind of free to take whatever I've created in simulation and try it with this test data that was not used to generate the model. And then what you can do is to see if your theorizing was valuable at all. You could also try to just do some kind of atheoretic, let me fit a model of this training data and try to predict over here on this test data. If my theory can do better, if I've actually added some social science theory that has some explanatory power, I should be able to beat this kind of atheoretic approach. Hey, Peter?
A great approach, but when I played around with it, it seems like it takes it too literally. Say, I'm a 35-year-old woman from Mexico. What would you do for this form? Or what would you vote on this question? And it's like, you run the simulation and it's like 90-10, but in the real world, it's going to be 60-40 or 70-30 because there's more to a person than just that persona.
Yes.
Is there a way to have it sort of randomly fill out the persona to match the population better?
Well, so this is where I think is actually really promising. We don't have to make up agents. There's lots of data that is detailed, micro data on people's attributes and beliefs and everything else. And we can use that as the data to create these agents. And with these large context windows, there's no reason not to basically just, hey, we'll give you the entire persona. But I think you're making a good point that they tend to be kind of like the Chekhov's gun. Like if you mention this thing, like I have to mention it in my response in some way. And I think that is kind of not a great feature of the agents that are created this way.
Say Linda is a feminist. They won't believe she's a bank teller.
Exactly. So this is, you could also let's fix this hypothesis, and we're going to take a study that already exists and explore it through simulation. So maybe some of you are familiar with this paper by Ryan Opriya. It's just really a remarkable paper. What the whole story, you're probably familiar with the idea of like loss aversion and like Kahneman and Tversky. He has a claim that basically what's really going on is it's not really a story about preferences. It's that people use heuristics in calculation, and that what they have to do an expected value calculation is what creates this pattern, this route. And how he shows it is he creates a new study where instead of saying, hey, what's your value for this risky lottery? You say, hey, there's a whole bunch of boxes. This is how many have these prizes. Like, so 75 each has $25 as a prize. The rest are empty. Okay. What we're going to do is we're going to open up all of the boxes, sum all the money, and divide by the number of boxes. And how much is that worth to you? It's the same arithmetic as an expected value calculation, but there's no risk, right? That's the point. And when you do this, you get this. He calls it the mirror. You get the same that you get from the original experiments where they're actually valuing risky lotteries. Okay, so Ryan presented this paper a few weeks ago, and my grad student was like, I'll do this right now, and he replicated it, not fully, but I'll show you what happens. So the key is that pattern, the two crosses. Go ahead. With the agents, yes. Sorry, yeah. So this is Claude, GPT 3.5 Turbo, Gemma, Llama Instruct doing the lottery versus the mirror treatment. And the key is this fourfold cross. That's kind of the signature pattern. But interestingly enough, if you do it with GPT-4, you get essentially expected value maximization. This is what a rational agent should do, a risk-neutral rational agent. So GPT-4 is kind of playing better than people here. However, if you create an agent and you say you're not so hot at math, you get the pattern accentuated and the GPT-4 pattern shows up. So what I think is a takeaway from this is it's actually, I think, evidence for Ryan's proposed mechanism, that this is like a heuristic about calculation, not about actual preferences. Okay. The most controversial.
Really ask if you're like risk averse or those other things, and see how much the math matters versus the other characteristics.
Yeah, I mean you can imagine creating agent. Right. That's nice. Like you could create agents that I'm going to endow you with this preference, and then do you see if you play in this way. The last one is this kind of new social science finding idea. I think that the idea here is there are novel micro findings about humans that are latent in the LLMs. The idea that there's like papers that haven't been written about how humans behave that the LLMs have essentially captured, but no human has noticed or written a paper about it. And why you might imagine that we could find these faster is that you can run experiments at a kind of a massive scale that no one could kind of do in a lab without millions and millions of dollars. The other is that maybe there are things where we're pretty sure we understand the micro behavior, but when you aggregate a bunch of these agents and let them do things, there's social science that we haven't quite put a word to or haven't created a theory for, because we couldn't really discover it in the past because we never got that configuration of people in this particular setting, and now we actually have a way to much more cheaply explore that possibility. So I think that's kind of like the research. So what I think. there's also a question of, what might make these things practically useful. So, if this is like something that I think is kind of embarrassing as a social scientist. If someone said to you, hey, I need to tell my car next week. You're an economist, what advice can you give? And we might say something like this, or we wouldn't. We would just say that's not really my research area. But it's like we don't really have a great way. And probably a lot of us have spent time in the natural sciences and probably at some point felt jealous that natural science theories often have this like, boy, how much precision do you need? I can make these precise precision predictions. And we're often saying like, well, it really depends on context and some factors that are sort of hard to quantify. And it's very difficult for us to kind of map any particular question someone has to a prediction about what will happen. Well, in this version of the paper, our theories about the social world are super simplistic. There's no kind of additional context. There's nothing about, the emotional states of the agent or the nature of the good or anything else. But when you can build these theories through simulation, it's not hard to imagine that that this is like the bargaining theory, right? Just like it has lots and lots of different aspects that could matter. And if you told the system like, hey, this is what I'm trying to do, it could lean on a representation that it's discovered through simulation of what's likely to happen in that particular scenario, with all the complexity and details that we think really matter, but we as social scientists don't have a great way of accounting for. But still, the key is that every path here is identified, and the system is not necessarily subject to this Lucas critique. And it's something that you could take and kind of improve over time or add to. Okay, so I know we're probably like close to time there. Yeah. So I think like what are a lot of the kind of next research questions already got brought up in questions. Can we, rather than boring hypotheses, could we have it propose more interesting hypotheses, either drawing from the literature or kind of being creative in different ways? Right now the models are just simple cause and effect, but like lots of real social phenomena, there's mediating causes, and this happens, and then this can kind of affect whether this other thing happens. So can we actually make more complicated models to simulate? And then I think the last is not something that any one researcher is going to do, but I think will be something like a collective enterprise is sort of figuring out when does this kind of work generally? Like when is this a reasonable approach, and when is it going to sort of fall flat on its face? So thanks so much.
All right, we have about 5 minutes for questions. Yeah. Okay, got it.
Thank you for your speech, Jason.
Hi, Jason.
I actually have 3 very quick questions. Do you use specific data to train agent? I mean, to make agent more differently instead of build agent just by define based on your dimension. Another question is, because most of the large language model currently is based on English.
Yep.
Actually, it's English-based behavior. And actually, the world is so diversified. So for different country, different speakers, the different language speaker, different nationalities. So how to make the experiments more reflect the whole global behavior, behavior. Third question is, do you think this kind of research is research on computers' behavior instead of human behavior? I mean, it's kind of a reflect of the computers' thinking instead of human thinking.
Yeah, let me do them in reverse order. So, I mean, I think the fact that it's a computer's thinking, but it's a computer that's been, a system that's been essentially created by us through our collective textual output. So I think it's a funhouse mirror of us. In a lot of places, that's going to be distorted and not realistic. But in others, it's probably useful. For the second question, does it reflect? Yeah, I mean, I think the training corpus probably is very English-centric. I think this gets back to the point of what social science questions are you interested in? I'm an economist. Economists think that their theories are extremely general models of like how all humans make decisions. Now, that's like not accurate, right? But that is kind of like where they're starting from. If you were doing something where you thought cultural differences really mattered, then yeah, I think that this could probably lead you astray. One interesting thing you can do with like some of these studies is translate them automatically into another language and rerun the study and see if there's differences. And then the first question is, are you doing anything to create richer agents? Not in this setting, but there's nothing to stop you. I mean, there's an enormous corpus of social science microdata that's about people answering questions or giving opinions or describing their characteristics. And that's sort of all right for use to create agents that you think are trying to capture, a particular human in a particular context. Yeah.
So I'm interested in doing experiments on models of students, right? So in education, we often say, here's 2 ways to teach something, which way is better? And it's been annoyingly frustrating that you have to run it on real students and you can't go faster than 1 semester per semester. So it'd be fantastic if we could run these kinds of experiments. But I think the reason that hasn't been done much so far is because we have lots of written material on the right way to solve something and frustratingly few on the kinds of mistakes that students make. So can you address that?
So there's this, there are some tutoring platforms that, have students like submit scans of their written work, right? And then it gets graded. I think that there is training data about bad work out there. And, you could imagine using that to build agents that are wrong in the way that students are wrong, like they have a common misperception. So I think it's probably a matter of going and finding the training data that we need that's wrong in a useful way. But I feel like to me that seems like a very, very promising direction. Michael?
Yeah, I'm curious. We've been spending a lot of time thinking about unobserved spurious correlations, essentially. So we see that in your experiment, the agents bargain in the following way. What if that's just because the model is, especially likely to come to agreement? They're just agreeable. And it's a thing that all of the agents are. It's just sort of a bias in the model. How would you rule out all of those kinds of, I guess, spurious correlations that might be leading to or blocking a result? Maybe they're just too nice and you can't get them to argue at all.
Well, I think that that's right. They're like obsequiously nice, and that often becomes a problem when you're trying to get them to press advantages. I think that there's no escape from the fact that like when you run an experiment, you get the effect of a cause. You don't get the cause of effects. Like you don't understand like why something happened. You just know when you manipulated this thing kind of popped out at the other end. This is why I think what you probably have to do is say, okay, maybe the fact that they have this long horizon in which to bargain is really what's driving the fact that they come to agreement. So let me try and say, hey, you only get 3 rounds, and you can make a take it or leave it offer 3 times. Let me see what that does to the probability of agreement. Now that doesn't fully answer the question, but like you can start exploring that hypothesis, and then ultimately, if you want to know if this is what people do in the real world, like you're not sort of freed from the obligation of going and like trying this in the real world. I think that the so what here is you can try those kinds of things much more easily than you could in the past. So that space of things that you think could be governing the responses is easier to explore.
One of the things that I've observed when I speak about the generative agents work is a pattern of people who come up to me afterwards and say, I got so inspired by this and I tried running the following simulation and the agents totally did something really bonkers. This entire approach makes no sense. Maybe they're trying to do, most recently it was like a micro institutions kind of simulation. And, I'm worried about us breaking the trust in this kind of approach if we don't have any sort of structured scientific method that helps us say, well, that kind of simulation is, that one you can trust. This one maybe has the following error by construction. And, is it that the model's wrong? Is it that, you didn't prompt it in the right way? People, I think, are losing trust in the method if they don't know what's causing it to go wrong.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the only solution to that is open source models, open source tools, and a culture of sort of sharing results and simulations where it's very easy for me to take what you did and tinker with it and vice versa. Because I don't think there's no theoretical answer to this. It's going to be an empirical exercise, and that hopefully will collectively come up with a point of view on when this is useful and when it's not.
Well, thank you, John. Regrettably, we are out of time. Thanks very much for joining us today. That was terrific.
Thank you.
And on October 18th, another special session, Friday, October 18th, we're going to have Deb Roy, also from MIT, coming out and talking about his work. So see you then.